Is that enemies to lovers? Enemies and lovers. Wait, that's even better. So for today's video, I thought I could do just kind of like a get ready with me / reacting to some unpopular writing opinions. So you guys actually sent me this a long time ago. I think I had actually solicited these opinions for a video that I was gonna make over a year ago now. I was like, I have no memory, literally zero recollection of having made this video. I had probably decided not to make it at some point, but I feel like it's a waste. Anyways, I thought we could just react to them now because I think some of them are interesting. The first one is, editing while writing your first draft is fine, actually. I feel, okay, so I'm not sure how unpopular or spicy this opinion is. I do feel like the most popular writing advice saying, especially when you're writing your first draft, is to not stop. I would be a hypocrite if I preached that advice. I very much like to edit as I go. So I'll stop to line edit, I'll go back and realize I need to add in like entirely new chapters and scenes and stuff like that. Cause I don't know, I feel like every writer is different. For some writers, they prefer to just get to the end of a draft. I do think that sometimes when you're reading back your draft, you're like, this is really, really bad. This particular advice might be not as popular, but I don't think it's a spicy writing take. Oh my god, this one's interesting. One of the most unattractive qualities in a writer is insecurity. If you don't like your writing, that's fine, that's normal, but people who go on and on about how bad they are, I don't want to talk to you. Okay, so I personally feel like I've never encountered someone like this. I more often encounter writers who are more arrogant, or if not arrogant, then slightly misinformed about the industry. And so I've encountered more of those kinds of writers rather than insecure writers who only talk about how bad their writing is. I find this one so interesting as well because I think that insecurity, I don't want to say insecurity is a good thing. That's not what I'm saying. Okay. It's not that insecurity is a good thing. However, I do feel like there is a fine line between insecurity and humility. I think there's a lot of benefits to never being satisfied with your writing and being able to see the flaws in it in order to improve. And I know that that's definitely not the same as insecurity, because at some point writers do have to develop confidence, but I feel like it honestly just comes with time. And the more you write, the more confident you are about your writing. I mean, I don't think it was until probably 3-ish years ago where I felt like I genuinely became a confident writer. And I've been writing for my entire life. I'll just say that as I was writing, I felt like, oh my god, my writing was so bad, but I was always constantly aware of the ways in which I wanted to improve. I have a lot of compassion for newer writers who are insecure and know that they aren't at the place they want to be. I think it's really important to be kind to those kinds of writers because with ChatGPT and so many of these AI writing tools, I think alienating writers is really dangerous because it turns them towards wanting to make the writing process easy. Going to these AI writing tools basically stop them from being a writer, because if you're using generative AI to write, basically robbing yourself of any opportunity to become a writer. I feel like most pantsers are just too lazy to outline, so they wing it. That is spicy. I don't know if that's unpopular, but I think that's pretty spicy. I also used to think that it was pretty impossible to write without an outline. I also think that there's only so much that you can plan for. A lot of the times you don't really know what your story needs until you're actually writing it, because you could think that, oh, this is the way that the story has to go. But then as you're writing, you get new ideas for things and you get new ideas for a scene or the world. Discovery writing has a lot of benefits, and it really depends on just what your personal writing style is. I do think it's generally pretty hard to wing an entire book. And I think as you start to write more books, you probably will get a feel for the types of story structures you like. Most writers that I know actually use a hybrid of outlining major beats, but maybe not the entire story. I personally like to know the endings of my books before I even start writing. I always find it so interesting when people have like extremely rigid ideas of like, this is the way that you must write, otherwise you're XYZ. I do encourage people to try outlining because it's something that worked for me. You don't have to read a wide range of genres to be a good writer. I don't think that you need to read or enjoy like every genre under the sun. If you know that you are, for example, like you want to write rom-coms, contemporary rom-coms, it's not like, okay, I'm gonna go read some like Ursula K. Le Guin or something. I do personally like to read across genres and like literary fiction. I think that there's so much that you can learn from reading widely, but I don't necessarily disagree with this person, because if you 100% know that you don't like a genre or that you don't typically enjoy certain kinds of stories, I don't think you should force yourself to read those stories. For me though, if a book gets really popular, if people, speak highly of a story, regardless of genre, I'm gonna be pretty interested in it because I want to know like what people find really good about the book. As someone who wrote and read a lot of literary fiction, and then decided to make the switch to writing genre fiction a few years ago, I think a lot of the things that I learned from writing literary fiction has informed my voice for my genre work. But I agree that not every writer has to read widely if they don't want to. But I do think writers should read a lot of the kinds of work they want to write. I will gladly read something with a boring plot if the characters are well written. I agree. I feel like I think a lot of people might not agree with this. Commercial fiction tends to favor plot and action over, or not over character arcs, but like there's different expectations with literary fiction and commercial fiction. And I've always been someone who's been a character first writer. So I will read basically anything if the characters are interesting. I think that this is something that literary fiction writers do really well, because literary fiction a lot of the times focuses on the character journey and on themes. The first draft of my debut novel, that draft was a lot more just like, it was so internal, it was so character driven. I had to revise in, entirely new like plot threads and stuff like that, because that's just the way it is, most people want action. Prologues aren't that bad. I think they can play a pretty important role in establishing the setting, tone, or style of a book. It's weird, some people are so against them. Yeah, okay, so I remember a few years ago I saw people having this discussion on like Twitter or something where readers were talking about how they skip prologues. I was so shook by this. I was like, what do you mean you're skipping literally the beginning of the book? Yeah, I honestly could not tell if it was rage bait because I was so shocked. So I agree. I like prologues. I think prologue hate is overrated. However, I do think that a lot of the times, if you're writing the first few drafts of a book, it's actually very hard to get prologues right. And so I think a lot of the prologue, anti-prologue sentiment comes from the fact that sometimes agents and stuff will tell you not to query with your prologue because prologues, the way that you wrote the prologue isn't interesting enough on its own, or sometimes you'll be asked to remove your prologue. I think it's mostly because sometimes you don't know what your prologue should be until you've finished writing the book or finished writing it several times. I've always struggled immensely with prologues, and I've always felt like, okay, this book definitely needs a prologue, but what is the best kind of prologue to write? What is a prologue that doesn't set the wrong expectations for a reader? If it's a bit of a tonal shift from the rest of the book, does it still make sense to keep it? I remember one time I asked my agent about prologues and she was like, yeah, they're fine, but a lot of the times you want to ask yourself, why shouldn't this prologue just be chapter 1 instead? My debut novel does have a prologue, but that prologue I wrote probably almost 10 drafts of just the prologue alone, there were so many different ways that I could think to start the story and to set up the mystery. And my debut novel is also a frame story. It's like told retrospectively. So I had all these different ideas for like, okay, we'll start the prologue in present day maybe. And so I had all of these different versions that started like 2 years like after the 2-year time skip that happens. And then I just completely scrapped that many drafts later. I think when I was editing the book with my editor after we had sold the book, I got this completely different idea for what to do with the plot. And so that's what happened. Yeah, I don't agree with prologue hate either, but I do think that they are hard to write well sometimes. You don't have to know every detail about your worlds. I think sometimes worlds are overwritten and better off vague. The more hard facts in the world building, the more inconsistent things show up. That world should be built around the story, not the other way around. So I think a lot of this comes down to, it depends on the story and it depends on the writer. I wouldn't confidently say that it's better for all books to have worlds that are vague. I think certainly it can be great for some kinds of stories, like if it's a cozy fantasy, for example. I'm not gonna think that much about like the geopolitics of like a cozy fantasy world. But if, for example, it's like hard science fiction, part of the reason that you're going into that story is because you want like really intricate world building, or you are going into the story and want to know how science and the technology work in this world. And that's part of the appeal of reading that kind of story. And I also say this as a writer who does prefer to shape my world around my story rather than the other way around. Aspects of the world building can be softer than others, but it doesn't mean that I would want to underwrite my world. One thing that I actually think about, you know, when I'm in just kind of my brainstorming phase with a book, like I haven't really started writing it yet, I think it's really good for writers to know more details about their world than they're necessarily going to actually put in their book. Well, my debut novel is a sci-fi, so like the technology, and then for the book that I'm currently writing, the magic system, there are a lot of things that aren't necessarily going to make the book, but I still kind of brainstormed those concepts because I think it's good for a writer to be able to know their world deeply, even if all of that information doesn't actually end up in the story, because it can make your world feel a little bit more lived in. You can pull from that knowledge to craft, you know, more nuanced characters, more layered scenes. With a vague world, you also run the risk of writing a very flat world. Okay, this one's kind of related, actually. I like info dumping. Why would I not want to understand the world before getting into the plot and characters? Also, if the world is unique, then give it all to me. This is kind of like opposite to the comment that we just read. I think that info dumping can be done well, but I kind of disagree that it should happen before you get to know the world and the characters. I think part of learning how to be a writer, if you're writing in the genre space, is to learn how to do exposition at the same time that you are building out character and plot. Because for most readers, they aren't going to want to open page 1, chapter 1, and basically get like a Wikipedia page or like a textbook. That's not how most readers are gonna want to read. It could be how some readers like to read, but not most readers. While I agree that it's okay to sometimes do a little bit of info dumping, you know, I don't think it's something that writers should fall back on. And I do think that part of learning how to write is learning how to do exposition well, so that you are onboarding your reader into your world and, you know, history and all that kind of stuff at the same time that you are endearing them to the character. I will say, though, that sometimes if you do want to info dump, I follow the rule of like letting my reader be confused for a while, because I think that a lot of readers will continue reading a story if they care about your characters. My debut, I'm pretty sure that I left a lot of the technology explanations until a little bit later. Like, I don't think I did that within the first like 3 chapters. I really focused a lot on like building out the characters and the inciting incident and the mysteries, because I think if readers care about that, they will then be more invested enough into the story that by the time that you are explaining the intricacies of a net running rig, for example, they are more likely to stick around, you know? I do think that a lot of the times writers can be really hesitant to under-explain things because they're like, oh, if a reader's confused, like, I want them to know everything about my world right away. And I don't think that readers need to know everything about your world right away. I think it's a lot safer for them to get to know your characters first before you like get into the nitty gritty. Which is not to say, again, that you should avoid info dumping, but you do have to be careful about where and how you're info dumping and for how long. Spice is overrated. Whether a book is spicy or not doesn't add or take away from the story. I want romance, not lust. Also, I don't know how people write spice knowing their family will read it. I do think that like intimate scenes can serve a purpose, and they can actually be, if it makes sense for your story, it can be a great way to explore character drama or character relationships or advance a character arc. But the part that's like, I want romance, not lust, this is interesting to me because I don't know if this person maybe like read a book that had spice in it and was like, oh, it's poorly written or it's insta love. But I don't think that the existence of a spicy scene automatically means that the relationship is not about romance, it's suddenly about lust. I think physical intimacy is sometimes just like a really, it's like any other scene where you kind of use a spice scene to, you know, explore character dynamics. Certainly there are probably books that rely on spice and don't have much other plot, but there are some books that like have spice in them but also have a plot. And in terms of like your family reading, like how do you write spice knowing your family's gonna read it? I don't think about my family as I'm writing. I kind of just write the story that needs to be written. As writers, if you're writing defensively, I think you're kind of doing your story a disservice. And this is true also, for example, if you are writing while thinking about your future 1-star reviews, or you're thinking about the people who are going to hate your book. To me, that is writing defensively. And you're going to write in such a way that you're going to feel stifled. You're going to maybe hold yourself back from exploring different avenues in the story that you otherwise would. I think that's unfortunate. I think a lot of writing is like putting away your shame, and you don't have to write things that you don't want to write, of course. Third person is so much more boring than books in the third person. Wait, what? Third person is so much more boring than books in the first person. So they're saying that they prefer first person. I've actually seen a lot of people say that they can't, like literally will not read a book that's in first person, and so a lot of people prefer third person. I think it's okay to have your preferences. Like if you strongly prefer to read and write in one versus another, like you do you know? But I honestly think that people who refuse on something like first person versus third person alone, you're cutting yourself off from so many amazing books. Like every story has a different purpose. So my debut novel was written in first person. I chose to write it in first person because I wanted a very specific type of voice for that story. The novel that I'm writing right now is like dual POV third person, and that's because this is a completely different type of story. It's okay to have your preferences, but I do think it's quite sad to avoid reading a story based on stuff like POV or verb tense. Like I've never fully been able to understand that. I'm trying to think if like I have an equivalent thing that I would stop myself from reading. Like the only thing that would put me off of reading a book is if there was like problematic subject matter or if it's poorly executed in some way. This is an unpopular book opinion, but love triangles are overhated. I agree, actually. I think that there's been a lot of popular media that has had love triangles in it. I think those love triangles just haven't been executed well. Like I'm thinking about things like The Hunger Games and Twilight. There's so obviously, this is more so for Twilight actually, there's so obviously a guy that the main character is going to end up with and the other guy is just getting in the freaking way. But I agree. I think that love triangles be executed really, really well if there's a lot of care and attention put into not only making the relationships equally interesting, but making the individuals in the love triangle interesting. And so that the reader cares about each character and doesn't just care about like the main ship. My debut novel technically is, I guess, not a love triangle, but it's like a love square, I guess. Getting to explore all of the really complicated relationships among the main characters and the reasons why they are drawn to each other, but also the reasons that, you know, they are toxic, the reasons that they wouldn't work together romantically at any given time. It's actually really, really fun to write all of those characters. And I think a lot of it just comes down to the fact that you have to treat each character as equally important. Enemies to lovers is usually either very generic or very toxic. You know what? I think this is true. I think, okay, so I don't know what to say about this one. I'm actually gonna say this is true, if only because every other romantasy that I see has enemies to lovers being promoted, like in its trope chart or whatever. I think we use the term enemies to lovers so loosely. People are throwing that around for like literally every main pairing that has a bit of banter or something. I agree that there's like, the term is overused, and I think sometimes it can be applied to ships that aren't literal enemies. Because to me, enemies to lovers is like, you guys are literal enemies, you know? But then people write enemies to lovers that is, like this person is saying, really toxic, where it's essentially like the one that we see all the time as like the most common example is a guy. It's usually the guy. It's usually a straight ship where the guy is from a colonizer nation and the girl is somehow oppressed. So yes, I agree. Like there's a lot of really toxic things there. Let me know what your favorite enemies to lovers ships are, where it's like true enemies to lovers. It's not just like rivals to lovers or misunderstandings, stuff like that. Actually, the book that I'm writing right now, I wouldn't classify it as enemies to lovers, even though the two characters don't like each other. You know what? This is how you lose the Time War. Is that enemies to lovers? Enemies and lovers. Wait, that's even better. To me, a book that is like actually enemies to lovers is when the two main characters, the external motivation / stakes of each character are in opposition to each other, alongside the characters not liking each other. And then I think to mitigate the toxic part, it's also how you think of power dynamics. I think that both characters, even though they're in opposition to each other, have to have kind of like one person has to have like an unhealthy power imbalance over the other. Because that's when you fall into some of the more toxic parts where it feels like you're maybe romanticizing colonization or abuse in some way. So there's a lot to think about there. Enemies to lovers is so popular, but it's also one that, because it's so popular, it's not necessarily always done well. I think that is where we're gonna stop for today. Thank you guys so much for sending these in. I know you guys sent these in like so long ago, but I would love to do an updated video. If you want to support my channel or any of my work, I have a Ko-fi. It's open for one-time donations as well as monthly memberships, and you get access to bonus / early content. My debut novel, Local Heavens, is a queer dystopian cyberpunk reimagining of The Great Gatsby, and it comes out in October. It's available for pre-order now. There will be pre-order incentives / prizes, so if you guys want to be eligible for that, make sure you guys pre-order and save your receipts. You can always add the book to your TBR on Goodreads and Storygraph, and that's it. That's all I have for today. Thank you guys for watching. Hope all your writing projects are going well, and I'll see you guys in the next video.